There are stories in music that begin with bright lights, big dreams, and the kind of rhythm that feels unstoppable. And then there are stories like this one, where everything changes in a single heartbreaking moment. Long before the Bar-Kays became funk legends, they were just a group of young musicians from Memphis, chasing a sound powerful enough to lift them beyond the world they knew. Their rise was fast, their future promising, until a tragedy tried to silence everything they had built. But the rhythm didn't stop. It was reborn. This is the journey of the Bar-Kays, a band that turned loss into legacy and transformed pain into power. Let's get into their story right now. Let me know where you're watching this from in the comments. Grab yourself a warm drink, maybe a cup of water or tea, sit back, and let's start this journey together. Before the Bar-Kays ever touched a stage or made a record that could move an entire room, their story began in the quiet corners of Memphis, a city where music drifted through the air like a second language. Memphis in 1966 was a place pulsing with soul. It was the home of Stax Records, a home for dreamers, and a training ground for young musicians who wanted to carve their names into the heart of American music. And somewhere within that world, a small group of teenagers began shaping a sound that would one day survive tragedy and define generations. They were students at Booker T. Washington High School, each carrying a different story, but connected by a shared pulse. Jimmy King with his guitar, Ronnie Caldwell with his keys, Carl Cunningham on drums, Phelan Jones on sax, Ben Cauley on trumpet, and James Alexander on bass. Most of them were barely old enough to drive, but together they created something that didn't feel like youth. It felt timeless. Their first rehearsals weren't glamorous. No polished studios, no expensive equipment, just a garage, a few amps, and a fire inside that no one could teach. Memphis was a city divided by many things, but music wasn't one of them. Music brought people together in ways politics never could. At night, as lights flickered over the small clubs scattered across town, the Bar-Kays stepped into spaces they technically weren't even allowed to enter as customers. The Palace, the Hippodrome, the Flamingo Room, Club Tropicana, the Blue Station, these were the places where their sound grew teeth, where their confidence was born, and where the crowds began to understand that these weren't just kids messing around after school. Something real was forming. Their high school band director, Harry Winfield, saw it long before the rest of the world did. He helped book them shows even though most of the members were underage. He understood the truth. Talent like theirs should not be limited by a birth year. Under his guidance, they learned how to carry themselves like professionals, how to show up early, how to build trust between notes, how to hold an audience even before a song began. And with every gig, every late-night performance, every improvised riff played in front of strangers, the identity of the Bar-Kays began taking shape. They were inspired by the instrumental soul sound of Memphis, especially acts like Booker T and the MGs and the Marquis. Those groups proved something important, that musicians could speak through their instruments as powerfully as any singer. The Bar-Kays didn't want to imitate. They wanted to contribute. Instead of relying on covers, they worked tirelessly on shaping a tone that felt energetic, youthful, sharp, and full of rhythm. Their chemistry was the kind you don't find often, the kind that's built on friendship first and ambition second. By 1966, they were determined to take their music further than neighborhood clubs. That determination led them to the doors of Stax Records, a place where legends were made. But getting inside wasn't easy. They visited multiple times, hoping someone would hear what they had, hoping someone would give them a chance. Those early days at Stax were filled with uncertainty. Rejection wasn't uncommon for young musicians. But these teenagers weren't ordinary. Their sound wasn't ordinary. And eventually, someone took notice. Jim Stewart, co-founder of Stax, heard the spark. He recognized that underneath the rawness lay a groove that could move crowds anywhere. He offered them a shot at recording. For a group of teenagers who grew up seeing Stax as the beating heart of their city, it felt surreal. Walking into that studio was like stepping into their dreams. The walls had already heard the voices of giants, and now the Bar-Kays stood there, ready to leave their mark. That first chance changed everything. It didn't instantly make them famous, it didn't erase their struggles, and it didn't promise a smooth road. But it marked the beginning of their ascent. It showed them that their dreams weren't out of reach. They were real, tangible, waiting to be shaped by hard work and belief. What made the Bar-Kays special wasn't just their talent, it was their unity, their sense of possibility, their belief in each other. They were friends before they were a band. They were dreamers before they were professionals. And long before they ever imagined standing under brighter lights or touring with a star, they were just young men in Memphis, creating a sound that would one day keep their name alive even after the world tried to break it. The early days of the Bar-Kays were built on innocence, courage, and rhythm. And behind every note they played, there was a heartbeat that refused to slow down. Before the fame, before the tragedy, before the reinvention, there was simply a group of kids chasing something bigger than themselves, a dream that began in a garage and slowly echoed far beyond it. Before the headlines and history books ever mentioned the Bar-Kays, this is where their journey truly started. When the Bar-Kays walked into Stax for the first time as recording artists, they carried the same energy they had in the garage, only now it was sharper, fuller, and ready for the world. Their breakthrough didn't arrive quietly. It came in the form of a bold, brassy, irresistible groove that would become one of the most recognizable dance tracks of its time. Jim Stewart sensed it the moment he heard the early takes. There was electricity in the room, something youthful, rebellious, and joyful all at once. That spirit became their first hit, a track that would announce their arrival, Soul Finger. Recorded in 1967, the song captured everything the Bar-Kays represented. It was playful but precise, built around a horn line that felt like a celebration, and a rhythm section that refused to sit still. When it hit the airwaves, people noticed. Soul Finger climbed the R&B chart, reaching number 3, while its B-side, Knucklehead, landed on the chart as well. For a group of teenagers who had spent years sneaking into clubs they were too young to enter, it felt like validation. But more than success, the song gave them identity. It made the Bar-Kays the newest rising stars in Memphis. Yet, even with a hit, celebrity didn't wrap around them overnight. Memphis was full of talent, and Stax carried giants on its roster. Still, the Bar-Kays stood out. They had a spark, the rare kind that made older musicians nod with respect. As word spread, they began to perform more frequently, and their confidence grew. They were no longer kids chasing a dream. They were musicians shaping their destiny. Their growing reputation eventually reached someone who would change their lives forever, Otis Redding. Known for his power, soul, and ability to command a stage like few others in American music, Otis crossed paths with the Bar-Kays during a night out in Memphis. The story goes that after an unplanned performance, Otis was struck by their energy. He saw more than youthful talent. He saw potential. And not long after, he invited them to become his touring band. For the Bar-Kays, the offer meant everything. It felt like they were stepping into a larger world, a world where their music could travel far beyond Tennessee. But the decision wasn't simple. They were still in high school, still tied to expectations of parents and teachers who weren't sure about the road life. Some families worried about the uncertainty. Others feared distractions from school. But the music was already pulling them forward, stronger than anything else. Eventually, the path became clear. They would go. Joining Otis Redding meant rehearsing harder, playing louder, and rising to a standard set by one of the greatest voices of their time. Their first major test came at the Apollo Theater. Walking into that historic stage meant stepping into a room where legends had stood. The lights were brighter, the stakes higher, and the audience more demanding than anything they had faced back home. But when the first note hit, the Bar-Kays held their ground. They delivered with heart, rhythm, and presence, proving they weren't just a studio success, they were a live sensation. That night in Harlem was more than a performance. It was a declaration. The Bar-Kays had arrived, and the world was watching. The success at the Apollo Theater didn't just open doors for the Bar-Kays, it launched them into an entirely different orbit. Traveling with Otis Redding meant stepping into the kind of spotlight most young musicians only dream of. They were no longer local favorites from Memphis. They were now sharing stages with one of the most powerful voices in American soul, performing in front of crowds that expected nothing short of excellence. And night after night, they delivered. Touring life came fast. Hotels, long bus rides, sound checks, last-minute rehearsals, and the adrenaline of standing behind a superstar, these were the new rhythms of their lives. The Bar-Kays were young, but they adapted quickly. Their sound tightened, their stage presence sharpened, and their confidence grew with every audience they won over. They weren't just supporting Otis. They were becoming an essential part of his live experience. Back home in Memphis, friends and family followed their journey with pride. It was surreal to imagine these teenagers who once filled local clubs now playing to thousands of people across the country. Even their teachers felt the shift. The boys had left school behind, but no one could deny they were learning something far greater: how to survive, thrive, and evolve in the real world of music. But as the pace of their career accelerated, life reminded them of its fragility. Otis Redding was recovering from surgery to remove polyps from his vocal cords, an operation that forced the band off the road for a short time. The break brought a moment of quiet, a pause in the whirlwind that defined their sudden rise, and for a brief season, everything felt steady. They rehearsed, spent time with family, and prepared for Otis's return to touring. When the call finally came to regroup for December shows, the Bar Ks were ready. The new schedule was demanding, built around smaller venues and quick travel, often relying on a private 8-seat plane to move between cities. Because the plane didn't have enough seats for everyone, 2 members had to fly commercial at each stop. It was a rotation meant to make things fair and convenient. No one ever imagined it would become the detail that changed their lives. On the morning of the flight from Cleveland to Madison, Wisconsin, fate took its position quietly, without warning, without sound. James Alexander and Carl Sims were assigned to fly commercial that day. They checked their bags, boarded their scheduled flight, and expected to reunite with the rest of the group shortly after landing. Nothing felt unusual. Nothing felt out of place. But when they arrived in Madison, the rest of the band wasn't there. Minutes passed, then hours. Confusion slowly turned into worry. And eventually, news began to ripple through the airport, through radio chatter, through the voices of strangers speaking softly with disbelief. A plane had gone down near Lake Monona. A witness had seen it fall from the sky. Emergency crews were on their way. And then came the words no young musician should ever have to hear. Otis Redding, the Bar Ks, the private plane, the crash. James Alexander later described the moment as a kind of emotional numbness when grief comes so suddenly that the mind struggles to keep up. Standing in an airport far from home, waiting for people who would never arrive, he had to face a reality too impossible to grasp. Most of his bandmates, his brothers in music, were gone. The man who believed in them, who carried them onto the national stage, was gone. Only one survivor had been pulled from the wreckage, trumpeter Ben Cauley. His testimony of that night would remain one of the most symbolic moments in soul music history. The tragedy didn't just stop their momentum, it shattered the world they had built. And yet, this moment, the darkest of their young lives, would eventually become the turning point that shaped everything the Bar Ks would become. But in that moment, all they felt was loss. In the days following the crash, silence settled over Memphis like a heavy fog. The city mourned Otis Redding, and it mourned the young musicians whose futures had been cut short before they truly began. For the Bar Ks, the tragedy felt too large to hold. James Alexander returned home carrying a grief deeper than anything he had ever known. Ben Cauley, still recovering, carried memories he never asked for. They were the only ones left. The band that had once stood 6 strong was now reduced to 2 survivors trying to understand how life could move forward. But even in the middle of heartbreak, there was something inside them that refused to fade. It wasn't the need for fame or recognition. It was something quieter, more human, the belief that music could still give meaning to loss. For James, carrying the name of the Bar Ks wasn't about continuing a career. It was about honoring the brothers he had lost. For Ben, it was about holding on to the only thing that made sense in a world suddenly turned upside down. They didn't rush back into the studio. They didn't chase opportunities. They rebuilt slowly, piece by piece, member by member, carrying both reverence and responsibility. When producer Alan Jones stepped in, he didn't try to reinvent them. He helped them find their new identity. He understood that tragedy had reshaped their lives, and the music needed to reflect that transformation. The search for new musicians was not just about talent, it was about spirit. They brought in guitarist Michael Toles, saxophonist Harvey Henderson, and drummers Willie Hall and Roy Cunningham. Each brought something different: fire, precision, imagination, and grit. And with this new lineup, the Bar Ks began to rediscover their pulse. It wasn't the same pulse as before the crash. It was deeper, stronger, born from survival. Their return to recording began with Gotta Groove, released in 1969. The title itself felt like a quiet declaration. We're still here. The music carried more edge, more confidence, and more freedom. It blended the soul roots of Memphis with a new funk attitude that made the songs feel larger, louder, and more daring. For fans who knew the story, the album wasn't just a collection of tracks, it was a rebirth. But the true turning point came when Isaac Hayes stepped into his own spotlight and invited the Bar-Kays to join him as his band. It was a partnership built on mutual respect. Isaac needed musicians who understood the soul of Memphis, and the Bar-Kays needed a stage that could hold the weight of their next chapter. Together, they created Hot Buttered Soul, a landmark album that not only redefined Stax Records but also introduced a new era of soulful experimentation. Many would later say the album helped save the label. The Bar-Kays stood behind Isaac Hayes with power and precision, shaping a sound that felt cinematic and bold. Audiences around the country saw a band transformed, not broken, not diminished, but reborn with purpose. Their performances carried the weight of the past and the promise of the future. And as applause echoed through theaters once again, the Bar-Kays stepped into the light not as survivors, but as artists who had turned tragedy into triumph. As the Bar-Kays continued to evolve, something remarkable began to happen. The raw soul that defined their early years slowly merged with a new musical pulse rising across the country. Funk was growing, stretching, experimenting, and the Bar-Kays found themselves right at the center of that transformation. Their work with Isaac Hayes had sharpened their instincts, expanded their sound, and pushed them into deeper creative territory. When they stepped into the studio for their next projects, they weren't just rebuilding a career, they were shaping a new identity. Their shift toward funk didn't come from a calculated plan. It came from curiosity, from freedom, and from the need to express the complexity of everything they had lived through. The music became heavier, thicker, and richer in texture. Guitars carried more edge, bass lines moved with swagger, horns punched through the rhythm with confidence. Their sound was no longer defined by innocence or youth. It was driven by purpose. The 1969 album, Black Rock, captured this transformation with clarity. It was adventurous, leaning into psychedelia and rock influences while staying connected to their soul foundation. For many listeners, the project signaled that the Bar-Kays were no longer the young group that recorded Soul Finger. They were artists, musicians who had something to say, something to fight for, and something to prove. The album reached new chart positions, drawing in fans who were discovering funk's evolution in real time. By the early 70 seconds, their live shows became a force of nature. The Bar-Kays weren't just performing, they were creating an experience. Stages exploded with movement, sound, and presence. Their concerts felt electric, unpredictable, and full of life. They brought the grit of Memphis, the polish of professional musicianship, and the energy of survivors who refused to fade. But behind the applause, the industry was changing. Stax Records, the label that had given them their first chance, was beginning to crack under financial pressure. The soul era that shaped their foundation was shifting. Music was evolving faster than ever, and new genres were emerging with their own power. Even in the middle of success, the Bar-Kays saw the signs, subtle reminders that no peak lasts forever. Still, they pushed forward with everything they had. Their chemistry was undeniable, their creativity bold, and their hunger stronger than any challenge ahead. The seeds of change were everywhere, but so was the fire that kept them moving. And even as the world around them shifted, the Bar-Kays continued to rise, crafting a legacy built on courage, reinvention, and rhythm that refused to disappear. Success in the early 70 seconds brought the Bar-Kays back into the spotlight, but behind the powerful rhythms and electrifying performances, life was becoming more complicated. Fame never protects artists from struggle, and for a group that had already survived one of the greatest losses in music history, the next chapter came with its own quiet storms. The Bar-Kays had rebuilt themselves once before, but rebuilding does not erase pain. It only teaches you how to move with it. As their sound evolved, so did the pressures around them. The music industry was shifting faster than anyone could keep track. Funk was rising, disco was knocking at the door, and the expectations placed on musicians grew heavier by the year. For the Bar-Kays, each decision mattered. Each album carried the weight of proving themselves again and again and again. Reinvention had once been a gift, but now it felt like a necessity for survival. Inside the group, changes were inevitable. Lineups shifted as members came and went, each departure leaving its own mark. Ronnie Gordon and Roy Cunningham stepped away, and for a band built on unity, those losses hit harder than the public ever realized. It wasn't drama, it wasn't scandal. It was simply life, the kind of life that challenges artists when the world isn't looking. Sometimes it was fatigue, sometimes creative differences, sometimes the emotional cost of carrying a legacy that was born from tragedy. The collapse of Stax Records only deepened the strain. Stax had been more than a label. It was home, a sanctuary, a creative universe that shaped the Bar-Kays from their earliest days. When the foundation cracked and eventually fell, it felt like losing another piece of their identity. Without Stax, the future felt uncertain. The band that had survived unimaginable loss now had to survive an industry changing beneath their feet. Financial instability followed, as it often does when labels fall and contracts dissolve. Tours became more demanding. The need to stay relevant grew stronger. Decisions became more complex, and the pressure to evolve weighed heavily on every member. They were artists first, but now they had to be strategists, businessmen, and survivors in a different way than they had been in 1967. There were moments when exhaustion set in, when the road felt longer, when the work felt heavier, when the distance from their early dreams grew wider. Grief doesn't disappear. It lingers quietly, especially for those who carry music as memory. Ben Cauley and James Alexander felt that weight deeply. Every show reminded them of the friends they lost. Every success carried echoes of the past. And as the years moved forward, that emotional burden became harder to navigate. But they rarely spoke about this publicly. The Bar-Kays weren't the kind of group that brought their pain to the microphone. They carried it with dignity, allowing the music to speak for them. Still, behind the stage lights, behind the powerful horns and explosive funk grooves, there were nights filled with doubt, silence, and reflection. The crisis of this era wasn't defined by a single event. It wasn't a headline or a scandal. It was the slow, steady accumulation of pressures that built over time, pressures that pushed the Bar-Kays to their limits and forced them to confront who they were becoming. It was the kind of struggle that tests not only creativity but identity, loyalty, and spirit. And yet, through it all, the Bar-Kays kept moving, even when the path ahead felt uncertain, because rhythm had always carried them through darkness before. And they believed, somehow, it would carry them again. When Stax Records finally collapsed, the shockwaves rippled through every corner of Memphis. For the Bar-Kays, it felt like losing a second home. The studio where they had learned to create, rebuild, and redefine themselves was suddenly gone. And without Stax, the support system they had relied on for years vanished overnight. The loss was not only financial, it was emotional, it was cultural, it was personal. As the music landscape shifted, the Bar-Kays found themselves standing at a crossroads. Disco was rising fast, swallowing radio playlists and club floors across the country. Trends were changing at a pace no band could fully predict. Funk had to fight harder to stay visible, and even harder to stay relevant. For a group that had built its identity on reinvention, this new wave of change brought questions they weren't always ready to answer. Their lineup continued to evolve, and every change chipped away at the sense of familiarity they once carried. New faces brought fresh creativity, but they also reminded the band of everything and everyone they had lost along the way. The departures weren't dramatic. They weren't explosive. They were simply the quiet, inevitable consequences of musicians walking their own paths. But even quiet losses hurt. The pressure to keep reinventing themselves became exhausting. The Bar-Kays were known for surviving tragedy, but survival takes a toll. Some nights, the applause wasn't enough to drown out the fatigue. Some shows felt heavier than others, as if the memories of the past were standing on stage with them. The world saw the energy, the costumes, the grooves, but behind the scenes, the emotional weight grew harder to carry. When Fantasy Records released Holy Ghost, a track Stax had left behind, it unexpectedly pulled the Bar-Kays back into the spotlight. The song became a favorite among DJs and young listeners discovering funk's deeper layers. But success brought new complications. Fans expected more. Labels expected more. And the band had to walk a thin line between honoring their roots and embracing new directions. There were moments when it seemed like the industry had moved on. Moments when they questioned whether there was still room for them in a world that often forgot its pioneers. The silence after those doubts was louder than any crowd they had ever faced. It was the kind of silence that only artists understand, the space between what once was and what might never be again. Yet even in those moments, the Bar-Kays refused to disappear. They kept recording, kept performing, kept fighting to hold on to the legacy they had built from ashes. The consequences of their journey were heavy, but so was their determination. And though the world around them shifted, their resilience never wavered. Because they had learned long ago that rhythm could survive anything, even the quiet that follows when the lights begin to fade. Long before the world understood what the Bar-Kays truly represented, their music had already begun carving its own path across American culture. Their journey had been marked by heartbreak, rebirth, and transformation. Yet the legacy they built reached far beyond their survival story. It lived in the grooves of every record they touched, and in the spirit of every musician who followed their lead. What the Bar-Kays created was more than a catalog of funk classics. It was a blueprint for resilience, reinvention, and the timeless power of rhythm. At the heart of their legacy was their ability to adapt, to reshape themselves without losing the soul that defined their earliest days in Memphis. From the bright, youthful sound of Soul Finger to the thick, textured funk of their later work, the Bar-Kays showed the world that evolution was not only possible, it was necessary. Their music carried layers of emotion, joy, determination, grief, confidence, and the fire that comes from refusing to disappear. Each album marked a new era, a new chapter, a new version of who they were becoming. One of their most enduring contributions came through their work as the backbone of some of the most important moments in soul music. Their role in Isaac Hayes' Hot Buttered Soul alone would have secured their place in history. The arrangements they played on that album pushed soul into cinematic territory, expanding what listeners thought the genre could be. Strings soared, rhythms stretched, and the music breathed in ways that felt larger than life. Many artists and producers would later point to that album as a turning point, a shift in what soul sounded like and what it could aspire to be. But the Bar-Kays didn't stop there. They embraced funk not as a passing trend, but as an opportunity to experiment. Their sound grew heavier, groovier, and more fearless. Tracks like Son of Shaft and later Holy Ghost carried an electricity that pulsed through clubs around the country. The bass lines were bold. The horns punched through the mix with purpose. The rhythms felt like they belonged not just to the moment, but to something bigger. These weren't just songs, they were experiences. Their influence spread far beyond live performances and radio play. As hip-hop began to take shape in the late 70 seconds and early 80 seconds, producers and DJs began searching for sounds that carried raw energy and attitude. They found exactly that in the Bar-Kays. Holy Ghost became one of the most sampled funk tracks of its era, resurfacing through new generations who didn't always know the band by name but recognized the power of their groove. Every sample was a quiet tribute, a reminder that great music never fades, it simply evolves. Many modern artists have credited the Bar-Kays as unsung heroes of the American funk movement. Their ability to merge soul roots with experimental funk positioned them as pioneers who opened the door for future acts to explore new textures and directions. Even artists who never performed with them felt the ripple of their impact. Bands who followed in the late 70 seconds, the 80 seconds electro-funk era, and even today's R&B musicians have echoed elements of their style, whether through horn arrangements, rhythm choices, or the emotional grit embedded in their performances. Yet perhaps the most profound part of their legacy wasn't musical at all. It was emotional. The Bar-Kays embodied survival not in a metaphorical, romanticized sense, but in the real, lived experience of moving forward after devastating loss. Their commitment to honoring the past while creating new work inspired countless fans who found hope in their story. They showed what it meant to keep going. Even when everything feels impossible, they showed that rhythm can be a lifeline, a way of remembering, a way of healing. And as the years passed, their music stood the test of time, proving that influence doesn't always need headlines or awards. Sometimes influence lives quietly, traveling through decades, shaping artists who may never even realize how deeply connected they are to the sounds that came before them. This was the legacy of the Bar-Kays, one built on courage, creativity, and the unwavering belief that music is at its strongest when it comes from the heart. As the years moved forward, something remarkable happened. The world began to look back. Time has a way of reshaping how we understand artists, revealing layers that weren't visible in the moment. And for the Bar-Kays, reflection brought clarity. They were no longer seen only as the young group behind Soul Finger, or the band that survived a tragedy with Otis Redding, or even the funk innovators who electrified stages in the 70 seconds. With distance, listeners and critics began to recognize the full scope of their contribution to American music. In the United States, retrospectives on soul and funk often point to the usual giants: James Brown, Parliament, Sly Stone, Earth, Wind, and Fire. But as the conversation deepened, historians and musicians increasingly began acknowledging the Bar-Kays as an essential piece of the bridge between soul's golden age and funk's explosive rise. Their evolution mirrored the evolution of black music in the country. They had the clarity of soul, the swagger of funk, and the resilience of artists who refused to be defined by circumstance. Documentaries, music historians, and interviews with Memphis musicians helped reignite appreciation for the band's journey. Younger generations, discovering the roots of groove-heavy music, found themselves drawn to the undeniable grit and personality in the Bar-Kays recordings. Their work with artists like Isaac Hayes resurfaced in conversations about the city's cultural identity, reminding audiences that Memphis was more than its blues history. It was a birthplace for reinvention. Fans who lived through the era often speak with a kind of reverence when they talk about the Bar-Kays. They remember the concerts where the room vibrated like it had its own heartbeat. They remember how the band seemed to turn grief into motion, lifting audiences into something almost spiritual. Many reflect on how the tragedy of 1967 shaped not only the band but also their connection to fans. The Bar-Kays became a symbol of strength, proof that artistry could survive even the darkest night. Globally, their legacy spread differently. In Europe, collectors and DJs embraced their catalog, especially the funk era that blended psychedelic textures with deep, driving rhythms. Vinyl shops in London, Amsterdam, and Berlin often placed the Bar-Kays alongside high-demand funk rarities, recognizing their importance within the genre's evolution. In Japan, music enthusiasts known for their deep respect for soul and funk embraced the band's musicianship, especially their tight horn sections and distinctive bass lines. In the hip-hop community, their impact was even more enduring. Holy Ghost became a cultural artifact, sampled, remixed, quoted, and rediscovered over and over. Producers loved the texture, the pulse, the attitude. To them, the Bar-Kays provided the raw ingredients that gave early hip-hop its backbone. Artists who grew up without knowing the band's full story still ended up feeling their influence through these samples. It was proof that music travels farther than names sometimes do. What resonated most, both in the United States and around the world, was the narrative of perseverance. The Bar-Kays didn't survive because circumstances were kind. They survived because the music demanded it, because something inside them refused to let their story end in tragedy. And listeners across decades, across borders connected with that truth, their legacy wasn't handed to them. They earned it, piece by piece, through evolution, reinvention, and the courage to keep going. Today, when fans revisit their music, there's a sense of gratitude. Gratitude for the sound they shaped, for the generations they influenced, and for the reminder that some stories grow more powerful with time. The Bar-Kays may not have always received the mainstream recognition their work deserved, but among musicians, collectors, and true students of American funk, their place is undeniable. They were more than a band. They were a testament to survival, to creativity, and to the unbreakable rhythm that continues to echo around the world. In the beginning, it was just a group of teenagers in Memphis, standing in a garage, dreaming of a stage bigger than the world they knew. And through every twist of fate, every triumph, every loss, Every reinvention, the Bar-Kays carried that same pulse with them. A pulse born from youth, shaped by tragedy, strengthened by survival, and transformed into a legacy that refused to fade. Looking back now, their story reads like a reminder of everything music can be. It can lift you, it can break you, it can save you. And for the Bar-Kays, music became the bridge between what they lost and what they created afterward. They were never defined by the tragedy of 1967, though the world tried to place that weight on them. Instead, they became defined by what they did next, the courage to rebuild, the bravery to evolve, and the heart it takes to stand back up when the world expects you to fall. Their rise from the ashes wasn't a comeback. It was a continuation of something that always lived inside them. From the soul-driven streets of Memphis to the bold, electric pulse of funk stages around the country, the Bar-Kays proved that rhythm could be a form of resilience. Every note they played carried echoes of their past, but none of it held them back. They kept moving forward, shaping a sound that would influence generations without ever demanding the spotlight for themselves. Today, their legacy stands not only in what they recorded, but in the lives they touched. Fans still remember the first time they heard Soul Finger. DJs still drop Holy Ghost into sets because the groove never gets old. Musicians still study their arrangements, searching for the magic that made those records timeless. And audiences across America, across the world, still feel the heartbeat of a band that refused to let tragedy write their final chapter. As we close this story, take a moment to think about what the Bar-Kays represent. Not just funk, not just soul, not just history, but endurance, creativity, reinvention, the quiet bravery of artists who kept going even when the road ahead was unclear. Before we go, I want to ask you something from the heart. Do you think the Bar-Kays ever received the recognition they truly deserved? Let me know in the comments. Share a memory, a song, a moment when their music found you, because remembering is how legacies stay alive. It's how artists like these continue to matter long after the spotlights dim. If this story moved you, if you believe legends like the Bar-Kays deserve their flowers, then I invite you to subscribe to the channel. Help us keep these memories alive. Help us honor the artists the world should never forget. Some stories fade, but theirs never will not, as long as we continue to tell it.